Slaves. The Rus were ruthless when it came to enslaving local populations and transporting them south. Renowned for their size, their physique, and their bravery, the Viking Rus had no cultivated fields and they lived by pillaging, according to one Arabic writer. It was the local population that bore the brunt. So many were captured that the very name of those taken captive, Slavs, became used for all those who had their freedom taken away, slaves. The Rus were careful with their prisoners. They treat the slaves well and dress them suitably, because for them they are an article of trade, noted one contemporary. Slaves were transported along the river systems, remaining chained while the rapids were negotiated. Beautiful women were particularly highly prized, sold on to merchants in Khazaria and Bulgaria, who would then take them further south, though not before their captors had sexual intercourse with them one last time. Slavery was a vital part of Viking society and an important part of its economy, and not just in the East. Considerable literary and material evidence from the British Isles shows that one of the most common purposes of longship attacks was not the indiscriminate rape and pillage of popular imagination, but taking captives alive. Save us, O Lord, one 9th century prayer from France implores, from the savage Norsemen who destroy our country. They take away our young virgin boys. We beg you to save us from this evil. Shackles, manacles, and locks have been found along slaving routes, especially in northern and eastern Europe, while new research suggests that holding pens previously thought to have been for livestock were in fact designed to corral people who were due to be sold in places like Novgorod, where the market lay at the intersection of the High Street and Slave Street. So rampant was the desire for profit from slavery that although some Scandinavians obtained licenses from local rulers to plunder new regions and take prisoners, others were more than willing to put each other in bond. As soon as one of them catches another, recorded one well-informed cleric writing in northern Europe in the 11th century, he would have little doubt that what to do next. At the first opportunity, he mercilessly sells him into slavery either to one of his fellows or to a barbarian. Many slaves were destined for Scandinavia. As one famous Old Norse poem, The Way of Rigsbla, put it, society was divided into three simpler categories: aristocracy, jarlar, freemen, carlar, and slaves, dralar. But many others were sent to where good money was paid for the fine specimens, and nowhere was there greater demand, nowhere was there greater spending power than the buoyant and wealthy markets in Atil that ultimately fed Baghdad and other cities in Asia, as well as elsewhere in the Muslim world, including North Africa and Spain. The ability and willingness to pay a high price provided rich rewards and laid the basis for stimulating the economy of Northern Europe. To judge from the coin finds, there was a surge in trade in the latter part of the 9th century, a time of major growth in the Baltic, southern Sweden, and Denmark, with towns like Birka, Wohlen, and Lund expanding rapidly. Fine spots spread over an increasingly wide area along the rivers of Russia, now a sharp intensification in levels of exchange, with a marked rise in a number of coins found that were minted in Central Asia, above all in Samarkand, Tashkent, Balkh, and elsewhere along the traditional trade, transport, and communication routes into what is now Afghanistan. Demand for slaves in these cash-rich locations was intense, and not just from those from the north. Huge numbers were imported from sub-Saharan Africa. One trader alone boasted of selling more than 12,000 black slaves in markets in Persia. Slaves were also taken from the Turkic tribes of Central Asia, who one author from this period notes were highly prized because of their courage and resourcefulness. When it comes to choosing the most precious slaves, noted another commentator, the best came from the land of the Turks. There is no equal to the Turkish slaves among all the slaves of the earth. Some idea of the likely scale of the slave trade can be deduced from a comparison with slavery in the Roman Empire, an area that has been studied in much greater detail. Of course, recent research has suggested that at the height of its power, the Roman Empire required 250,000 to 400,000 new slaves each year in order to maintain the slave population. The size of the in fact, the majority of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. The size of the market in the Arabic-speaking lands was considerably larger, assuming the demand for slaves was analogous, stretching from Spain through to Afghanistan, which would suggest that the number of slaves being sold may have been far greater even than those for Rome. And although the limitations of the source material are frustrating, some idea of the likely scale comes from the fact that one account talks of a caliph and his wife owning 1,000 slave girls each, while another was said to own no fewer than 4,000. Slaves in the Muslim world were as ubiquitous and silent as they were in Rome. Rome also provides a useful comparison for the way that slaves were bought and sold. In the Roman world, there was keen competition between the wealthy for prize captives taken from beyond the empire's frontiers. Curios, valued for their unusual looks and as talking points. Personal preference also played a part, with one well-appointed aristocrat insisting on having matching slaves, all equally attractive and all of the same age. Similar ideas prevailed with rich Muslims, as later guidebooks to help with the slave buying process make clear. Of all the black slaves, wrote one 11th century author, the Nubian women are the most agreeable, tender, and polite. Their bodies are slim with a smooth skin, steady and well proportioned. They respect their master as if they were created to serve. Women of the Bija people, whose home was in what is today Sudan, Eritrea, and Egypt, have a golden complexion, beautiful faces, delicate bodies, and smooth skins. They make pleasant bedfellows if they are taken out of their country while they are still young. 1,000 years ago, money could not buy love, but it could help you get what you wanted. Other guidebooks offered equally helpful pointers. When you set out to buy slaves, be cautious, wrote the author of another 11th century Persian text, best known as the Qamusnama. The buying of men is a difficult art because many a slave appears to be good, but turns out to be quite the opposite. Most people imagine that buying slaves is like any other form of trading, the author added. In fact, the skill of buying slaves is a branch of philosophy. Beware of yellowness of complexion, a sure sign of hemorrhoids. Be careful, too, of men blessed with good looks, floppy hair and eyes. A man having such qualities is either over fond of women or prone to act as a go-between. Make sure to have a possible purchase lie down. Then you should press on both sides and watch closely for any signs of inflammation or pain. And double-check hidden defects such as bad breath, deafness, stutter, or hardness at the base of the teeth. Follow all these instructions and plenty more besides, the author declared, and you will not be disappointed. Slave markets thrived across Central Europe, stocked with men, women, and children waiting to be trafficked to the east and also to the court at Cordoba in Spain, where there were more than 13,000 Slavic slaves in 961. By the mid-10th century, Prague had become a major commercial center, attracting Viking Rus and Muslim merchants to buy and sell tin, furs, and people. Other towns of Bohemia likewise were good places to buy flour, barley, and chickens, and slaves, all of which were very reasonably priced, according to one Jewish traveler. Slaves were often sent as gifts to Muslim rulers at the start of the 10th century. For example, an embassy from Tuscany to Baghdad brought the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtafi a selection of high-value gifts, including swords, shields, hunting dogs, and birds of prey. Among other presents offered as a token of friendship were 20 Slavic eunuchs and 20 particularly beautiful Slavic girls. The flower of youth from one part of the world was exported to indulge those in another. The engagement with long-distance trade was so extensive that when Ibrahim ibn Yaqub passed through Mainz. He was astonished by what he found in the markets. "It is extraordinary," he wrote, "that one should be able to find in such far western regions aromatics and spices that only grow in the far east, like pepper, ginger, cloves, nard, and galingale. These plants are all imported from India, where they grow in abundance." That was not all that surprised him. So too did the fact that silver was in use as currency, including coins minted in Samarkand. In fact, the impact and influence of coins from the Muslim world had been felt much farther away and would continue to be so for some time to come. Around 800 CE, King Offa of Mercia in England, constructor of the famous dike to protect his lands against the incursions of the Welsh, was copying the design of Islamic gold coins for his own currency. He issued coins with the legend Offa Rex, or King Offa, on one side and an imperfect copy of Arabic text on the other, even though this would have meant little to those handling coins in his kingdom. A large hoard found in Lancashire and today held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford also contains many Abbasid coins minted in the 9th century. That the currency had reached the backwaters that were the British Isles is an indication of just how far the markets of the Islamic world had sprawled. It was the sale of slaves that paid for the imports that began to flood into Europe in the 9th century. The spices and drugs that are increasingly visible in the sources as highly desirable luxury objects or as medical necessities were funded by large-scale human trafficking. And it was not only the Viking Rus who profited from the almost insatiable demand for slaves. Merchants in Verdun made immense profits selling eunuchs, usually to Muslim buyers in Spain. Jewish traders who dealt with long-range commerce were also heavily involved in the sale of young girls and boys, as well as eunuchs, as Arabic sources from this period suggest. Other sources likewise note the role played by Jewish merchants in bringing slaves and boys and girls from Europe and carrying out operations to castrate young men on arrival, presumably as a form of gruesome certification procedure. The slave trade promised good returns, which was one reason why it was not only European slaves that were brought east. Muslim entrepreneurs reportedly also got in on the act, raiding Slavic lands from eastern Iran, although enslaved captives pointedly had their manhood left intact, their bodies unspoiled. Such captors were also turned into eunuchs and were highly valued. If you took Slavic twins, wrote one Arabic author in this period, and castrated one, he would certainly become more skillful and more lively in intelligence and conversation than his brother, who would remain ignorant, foolish, and exhibit the innate simple-mindedness of the Slavs. Castration was thought to purify and improve the Slavic mind. Better still, it worked, wrote the same author, though not for the blacks, whose natural aptitudes were negatively affected by the operation. So great was the scale of traffic of Slavic slaves that it impacted the Arabic language. The word for eunuch comes from the ethnic label referring to the Slavs. Muslim traders were highly active in the Mediterranean. Men, women, and children were brought from all over northern Europe, where there was a busy market for buying and selling slaves, often passing through subsidiary markets where Irish and Flemish slaves were sold to third parties. Rome was another key slave trading center, though some found this repugnant. In 776, Pope Hadrian I described the scale of humans like livestock, condemning the sale of men and women to the unspeakable race of Saracens. Some, he claimed, had boarded ships bound for the east voluntarily, having no other hope of staying alive because of recent famine and crushing poverty. Nevertheless, we have never sunk to such a disgraceful act of selling fellow Christians, he wrote, and God forbid that we should. So widespread was slavery in the Mediterranean and the Arabic world that even today regular greetings reference human trafficking. All over Italy, when they meet, people say to each other, Chow, as it is more commonly spelt, does not mean hello. It actually means I am your slave. There were others who viewed the bonding of Christians into captivity and their sale to Muslim masters as indefensible. One such was Rembert, Bishop of Bremen, who used to tour the markets in Hedeby on the borders of modern Germany and Denmark in the late 9th century, ransoming those who professed their Christian faith, but not those who did not. This sensibility was not shared by all, however. Among those with no compunction about human trafficking were the inhabitants of an uncompromising lagoon located at the northern point of the Adriatic. The wealth is accumulated from slave trading, and human suffering was to lay the basis for its transformation into one of the crown jewels of the medieval Mediterranean, Venice. The Venetians proved to be singularly successful when it came to business. A dazzling city rose up from the marshes, adorned with glorious churches and beautiful palazzi, built on the lucrative proceeds of prolific trading with the East. While it stands today as a glorious vision of the past, the spark for Venice's growth came from its willingness to sell future generations into captivity. Merchants became involved in the slave trade as early as the second half of the 8th century, at the very dawn of the new settlement of Venice, though it took time for the benefits and the profits to flow through in volume. That they eventually did so is indicated by a series of treaties drawn up a century later, in which the Venetians agreed to be bound by restrictions on the sale of slaves, including returning slaves to other towns in Italy who had been brought to Venice illegally for sale. These negotiations were in part a reaction to the growing success of the city, an attempt to clip Venetian wings by those threatened by its affluence. In the short term, the restrictions were circumvented by raiding parties that captured non-Christians from Bohemia and Dalmatia and sold them on at a profit. In the longer term, however, normal business was resumed. Treatises from the late 9th century suggest that Venice simply paid lip service to local rulers who were concerned that it was not just slaves that were being sold, but also freemen. The Venetians were accused of willingly selling the subjects of neighboring lands, whether Christians or not. Eventually, the slave trade began to dwindle, at least from Eastern and Central Europe. One reason for this was that the Viking Rus shifted their focus from long-distance trafficking to the business of protection rackets. Attention focused on the benefits that the Khazars enjoyed from the trade that passed through towns like Atil, thanks to the levies raised on all merchandise transiting Khazar territory. The famous Persian geographical treatise Hudud al-Alam states that the very basis of the Khazar economy lay in its tax revenues. The well-being and wealth of the king of the Khazars are mostly from maritime duties. Other Muslim commentators repeatedly note the substantial tax receipts collected by the Khazar authorities from commercial activities, which included levies charged on inhabitants of the capital. Inevitably, this caught the attention of the Viking Rus, as did the tribute paid to the Khagan by the various subject tribes. One by one, these were picked off and their loyalties and payments redirected to aggressive new overlords. By the second half of the 9th century, the Slavic tribes of central and southern Russia were not only paying tribute to the Scandinavians, but were being forbidden to make any further payments to the Khazars on the ground that there was no reason for them to pay it. Payment was to be made to the Rus leader instead. This mirrored practices elsewhere, such as in Ireland, where protection money gradually replaced human trafficking. After being attacked year after year, records record the Annals of St. Bertin. The Irish agreed to make annual contributions in return for peace. In the East, it was not long before the increasingly heavy presence of the Rus resulted in outright confrontation with the Khazars. After launching a series of raids on Muslim trading communities on the Caspian Sea that spilled rivers of blood and continued into the Viking Rus, were gorged with loot and worn out with raiding, the Khazars themselves were attacked. Atil was sacked and completely destroyed in 965. If a leaf were left on a branch, one of the Rus would carry it off, one commentator wrote. Not a grape, not a raisin remains in Khazaria. The Khazars were effectively removed from the equation, and profits from trade with the Muslim world flowed in even greater volumes towards northern Europe, as the quantities of coin hoards found along the waterways of Russia indicate. By the end of the 10th century, the Rus had become the dominant force on the western steppe, controlling lands that stretched from the Caspian across the north of the Black Sea as far as the Danube. One source talks of the vibrancy of the markets they now oversaw, where it was possible to buy gold, silks, wine, and various fruits from Greece, silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia, and from Rus, furs, wax, honey, and slaves. However, the authority they exerted over these lands was not absolute. Relations with the nomadic peoples were often tetchy because of the competition for resources, as the ritual execution of one prominent Rus leader in this period by Pecheneg steppe nomads shows. The capture of the prince was gleefully celebrated, and his skull was lined with gold and kept as a victory trophy to be used to celebrate ceremonial toasts. Nevertheless, in the course of the 10th century, Rus' control of the waterways and of the steppes continued to strengthen, and the communication routes running southwards became increasingly secure. This process was accompanied by a gradual transformation of commercial, religious, and political orientation. One reason for this was that after nearly 300 years of stability and affluence, the Caliphate in Baghdad underwent a series of dislocations. Prosperity had served to loosen ties between the center and outlying regions, which in turn opened possibilities for friction as local potentates built up power and came into conflict with each other. The danger that this could pose was graphically shown when Basra was attacked in 923 by Shia insurgents before Mecca was attacked 7 years later, and the sacred Blackstone looted from the Kaaba. A series of unusually severe winters between the 920s and 960s made matters worse. Conditions were so bad that food shortages became increasingly regular. It was not unusual for people to be forced to pick the grains of barley from the dung of horses and asses and eat them, wrote one author. Rioting and civil disorder broke out frequently. As one Armenian chronicler put it, after 7 successive years of crop failure in the 950s, many went mad and attacked each other senselessly. Internal unrest enabled a new dynasty, the Buyids, to establish political control over much of the Caliphate's core territory in Iran and Iraq, retaining the Caliph as a figurehead with greatly reduced powers. In Egypt, on the other hand, the regime was toppled entirely in a 10th century version of the Arab Spring. Shia Muslims, who had previously managed to establish an emirate in North Africa that was more or less independent of the mainstream Sunni caliphates of Baghdad and Cordoba, moved on the Egyptian capital, Fustat. In 969, taking advantage of the catastrophic failure of the annual Nile floods that left many dead or starving, revolution spread through North Africa. The new masters were known as Fatimids, who, as Shia Muslims, had very different views about legitimacy and authority and about the true legacy left by Muhammad. Their rise had serious implications for the unity of the Muslim world. Rifts were opening up, with fundamental questions being asked about the past, present, and future of Islam. The upheaval and the resulting decline of commercial opportunities was one reason why the Viking Rus increasingly turned their attention to the Dnieper and the Dniester rivers feeding into the Black Sea, rather than moving along the Volga and towards the Caspian. Their attention began to turn away from the Muslim world to the Byzantine Empire and to the great city of Constantinople, fabled in Norse folklore as Miklagarth, that is, the great city. The Byzantines were wary of the attentions of the Rus, not least since a daring raid in 860 had taken the city's inhabitants and its defenses completely by surprise. Who are these fierce and savage warriors ravaging the suburbs, destroying everything? Wailed the Patriarch of Constantinople, thrusting their swords through everything, taking pity on nothing, sparing nothing. Those who died first were lucky ones, he went on. At least they were spared knowledge of the calamities that followed. Rus' access to the markets of Constantinople was tightly regulated by the authorities. One treaty from the 10th century notes that a maximum of 50 Rus were allowed into the city at any one time and had to enter through a given date. Their names were to be recorded and their activities in the city monitored. Restrictions were set on what day they could and could not buy. They were recognized as dangerous men who needed to be treated carefully. Nevertheless, relations eventually began to normalize as towns like Novgorod, Chernigov, and above all Kiev evolved from trading stations into fortified strongholds and permanent residences. The adoption of Christianity by the Vikings ruler Vladimir in 988 was important too, both because it led to the creation of an ecclesiastical network of ministered at the outset by clergy sent from Constantinople, and because of the inevitable cultural borrowings that flowered and flowed northwards from the imperial capital. These influences eventually affected everything from icons and religious artifacts to the design of churches and to the way that the Rus dressed. As the Rus economy became more mercantile, the warrior-like society became increasingly urban and cosmopolitan. Luxury items like wine, oil, and silks were exported from Byzantium and sold on, with traders recording invoices and receipts on birch bark. The redirection of the gaze of the Rus from the Muslim world towards Constantinople was the result of a pronounced shift in Western Asia. For one thing, successive emperors had taken advantage of the unrest and uncertainty in the Abbasid Caliphate. Many Byzantium's eastern provinces had been lost during the Muslim conquests, and this led to a fundamental reorganization of the empire's provincial administration. In the first half of the 10th century, the tide began to turn. One by one, bases that had been used to launch assaults on imperial territory in Anatolia were picked off and recovered. Crete and Cyprus were retaken, restoring stability to the eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean, which had been at the mercy of Arab pirate raids for decades. Then, in 969, the great city of Antioch, a major commercial emporium, as well as a center for textile production, was also seized. This reversal of fortune spurred a sense of revival in the Christian world. It also represented a significant redirection of assets and revenues away from Baghdad and towards Constantinople. Tax and customs revenues that had previously flowed towards the caliphate now filled the imperial treasuries. This heralded the beginning of a golden age for Byzantium, a period of artistic and intellectual renaissance among philosophers, scholars, and historians, of large-scale building of churches and monasteries, and the founding of institutions such as a law school to train judges who could oversee the running of an expanded empire. Byzantium was also a prime beneficiary of the breakdown in relations between Baghdad and Egypt in the late 10th century. In the late 980s, Emperor Basil II came to terms with the newly proclaimed Fatimid Caliph, establishing formal trade links and promising to have his name proclaimed in the daily prayers said in the mosque in Constantinople rather than that of his Abbasid rival in Baghdad. Buoyant markets in the imperial capital, fueled by economic and demographic growth, were mirrored by introspection and uncertainty in the Abbasid Caliphate. The result was the reorientation of trade routes from the east, with a clear shift away from the continental hinterland through Khazaria and the Caucasus to the Red Sea. The land routes that had made Merv, Ray, and Baghdad blossom were supplanted by shipping along the Maritime lanes. The boost to Fustat, Cairo, and above all to Alexandria was unmistakable. with the middle classes mushrooming as these cities thrived. Byzantium was well placed and soon began to enjoy the fruits of its new relations with the Fatimids. From the later 10th century, as Arabic and Hebrew reports make clear, merchant ships were putting in and sailing off from Egyptian ports around the clock, heading for Constantinople. Egyptian textiles became prized across the eastern Mediterranean. Linen produced at Tinis was also, after that, Nasiri Khusraw, one of the great Persian writers and travelers of the period, reported, "I have heard that the ruler of Byzantium once sent a message to the Sultan of Egypt that he would exchange 100 cities of his realm for Tinis alone." The appearance of Amalfitani and Venetian merchants in Egypt from 1030s and from Genoa 3 decades later revealed that others from further afield than Constantinople were alert to the opening up of new sources of goods. From the point of view of the Rus and the new northern trade networks, the changes in the principal routes to market for spices, silks, pepper, hardwoods, and other items brought from the east had little impact. There was no need to have to choose between Christian Constantinople and Muslim Baghdad. On the contrary, if anything, having two potential sources for buying and selling goods was better than having one. Silk reached Scandinavia in considerable quantities, as testified by the recovery of more than 100 silk fragments from a remarkable ship excavated at Oseberg in Norway, and also from Viking graves where silks from the Byzantine world and Persia were buried as prestige objects alongside the men who had owned them. There were still those in the mid-11th century who thought that they would make their fortunes in the Islamic lands of the East, just as their forefathers had done. A runestone by Lake Malar near Stockholm in Sweden, set up in the middle of the 11th century by a woman named Tola to commemorate her son Haradal and his brothers in arms, provides one example. Like men, they went a long way in the search for gold. It states that they had their successes, but then died in the south in Serkland, that is to say, in the land of the Saracens, or the Muslims. Or there is the stone set up by Godleif in memory of his son Slagve, who met in his end in the east in Khwarizm. Texts like the Saga of Yngvar, the Wayfarer, and Haraldr's brother likewise commemorate ambitious escapades that took Scandinavians to adventures in the Caspian and beyond. In fact, recent research suggests that a permanent Viking colony may even have been established in Persian Gulf in this period. But attention was increasingly focused on the Christian East and on Byzantium. As Western Europe's horizons expanded, there was rising interest in visiting the land where Jesus Christ had lived, died, and risen from the dead. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem became a source of understandable kudos. Exposure to the holy city also underlined the paucity of the Christian heritage of Western Europe, particularly when compared to the Byzantine Empire. Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, had begun the process of bringing relics to Constantinople in the 4th century. By the 11th century, the astonishing collections in the city were widely held to include relics such as the nails that had been used to crucify Jesus, the crown of thorns, the clothes over which lots had been cast, and parts of the true cross, as well as hair of the Virgin Mary, the head of John the Baptist, and much more besides. By contrast, there was little of note in the reliquaries of Europe. Although kings, cities, and church foundations were becoming richer, they had little physical connection with the story of Jesus Christ and his disciples. And each one of these cathedrals had a relic. Jerusalem and Constantinople, as the home and guardian of Christianity, grew growing numbers of men to the Christian East and to the imperial capital in particular, in order to trade, to take service, or to simply pass through on the way to the Holy Land. Men from Scandinavia and the British Isles were welcomed into the Varangian Guard as an elite corps entrusted as the bodyguard of the emperor himself. It became a rite of passage to serve in this brigade, with men such as Haraldr Sigurðarson, later king of Norway and better known as Harald Hardrada, serving in the brigade before heading for home. The call of Constantinople echoed loudly around all of Europe in the 11th century. Documents record that in the 11th century it was home to men from Britain, Italy, France, and Germany, as well as from Kiev, Scandinavia, and Iceland. Traders from Venice, Pisa, Amalfi, and Genoa set up colonies in the city in order to buy goods and export them home. The places that mattered were not in Paris or London, in Germany or Italy, but in the east. Cities that connected to the east were important, like Kherson in the Crimea, or Novgorod, cities that linked to the Silk Roads running across the spine of Asia. Kiev became a linchpin of the medieval world, evidenced by the marriage ties of the ruling house in the second half of the 11th century. Daughters of Yaroslav the Wise, who reigned as Grand Prince of Kiev until 1054, married the King of Norway, the King of Hungary, the King of Sweden, and the King of France. One son married the daughter of the King of Poland, while another took as his wife a member of the imperial family of Constantinople. The marriages made in the next generation were even more impressive. Rus princesses were married to the King of Hungary, the King of Poland, and the powerful German Emperor Henry IV. Among other illustrious matches was Gaitha, the wife of Vladimir II of Monomach, the Grand Prince of Kiev. She was daughter of Harold II, King of England, who was killed at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The ruling family in Kiev was the best connected dynasty in Europe.